Good evening. Today I want to start talking about the naval events during the American Civil War. Well, the land battles are quite famous and have been studied a lot, but the events at sea involving the military navies are definitely much less known and studied, right? And so, in my opinion, this deserves special attention, also because what's fascinating is that in this kind of war, besides, let's say, the clashes between sailors, there was also a technological war, a war between scientists, where a scientific invention, maybe an offensive one, would inevitably prompt efforts to find another invention that could neutralize that offense, and so on, in a continuous spiral of inventions and counter-inventions. So, I think it's definitely interesting to see all these developments. And what we're doing today is kind of a pilot episode to take stock of what the technological situation of the Navy was at that time, so that in the next episodes, as we go along, not just covering the military events, but also the various new discoveries that will happen during the Civil War thanks to inventors from both the North and the South, we can see how things develop. So, let's start by taking a look at what the global situation was like. The Napoleonic Wars had ended with the British Navy ruling the seas. And ruling the seas, too, ruling the seas were also the ships of the line. These enormous ships of the line, with about 100 cannons, incredibly sturdy, capable of sailing in any kind of weather and able to fight, and almost unsinkable, precisely because of their design, thanks to the shipbuilding technology of these sailing vessels, which had reached its peak by then. Just think, cannonballs couldn't even manage to sink these ships. In fact, the planking was built in such a way that even a heavy cannonball. In fact, the French, in order to defeat the English, had come up with the idea of bringing cannons onto their ships that fired 15-kilo cannonballs, and even bigger ones, just to try to bring down these sailing ships. But in reality, these solid cannonballs would enter the hull, but then they wouldn't cause any further damage, because the planking inside would tend to swell up, to compensate, so basically to patch up the hole that was made. The only way to, well, not really sink, but to make these sailing ships unusable, was to fire cannonballs chained together so that they would cut down the masts, making the ship immobile and open to being boarded. Another, well, the only weak point of these sailing ships was that, obviously, they depended on the wind. In the case of a dead calm, they were basically stuck, but above all, when there were storms near the coast, it was very dangerous to be on these sailing ships because you risked crashing into the rocks, into the cliffs. So, what happened then? In the years following the Napoleonic Wars, inventors, especially those working with artillery, wanted to find something, a device that could destroy these sailing ships. They had come up with some explosive shells, right? Instead of having solid cannonballs, there were these hollow cast iron balls filled with gunpowder that would explode at a certain moment. But the problem was exactly that certain moment. So, there were systems like using fuses, let's say, wooden cones of a specific length, carefully designed to determine the exact moment it should explode, filled with gunpowder, and these were inserted into the cannon. But they were very dangerous because the cannon, since the projectile was a round ball, This grenade tended to spin inside the barrel, and the flames would often ignite the fuse prematurely, so it could explode while still inside the barrel or too close to it. Another method, for example, was to use a charge that was already lit, a grenade that was already burning, quickly shove it into the mouth of the cannon, and then fire the cannon. But you can understand that if the main charge didn't go off, the whole cannon would blow up, with consequences for the crew. So, for this reason, explosive grenades up until the late 1700s, or actually, even later, up until the 1800s, were fired only from mortars. Large caliber mortars, where the grenade could be properly placed with the fuse facing outward so it wouldn't ignite prematurely, and these mortars could fire at very steep angles, from 45 to 90 degrees, so the projectile would then fall back down onto the enemy. But they were clearly used on land, that is, against fortifications, against armies. Sometimes they could also be used from ports to bombard enemy ships. But you can understand that with such long and arched trajectories, it was practically impossible to hit a moving target. Frederick II of Hohenzollern, the Prussian king, in the mid-1700s also invented another type of weapon, the howitzer. The howitzer was something in between a cannon and a mortar, meaning it had a somewhat arched trajectory, about 45 degrees, but the howitzer had a short barrel that fired small caliber projectiles, again to avoid the problem of premature explosions. That is, with this howitzer, you could also properly set the shell, making sure the fuse or the wick didn't ignite prematurely, but precisely to avoid explosions. You couldn't use very high charges. And here too, this weapon couldn't be used on ships, precisely because these somewhat arched trajectories made it really difficult to hit a moving ship, especially if your own ship was also moving. You always needed cannons that had a more direct, immediate shot, fairly close range, with a speed such that I would aim, the projectile would fire, and within just a second or two it could hit the target. So, to solve this problem, there was an artillery officer, a certain Henri Paixhans, who in 1824 came up with a new system to use these explosive shells on ships as well, allowing them to be fired from cannons. But Paixhans wasn't really a true inventor. He was more of a clever person who brought together many small discoveries that had been made over the years and combined them all. For example, to prevent the shell from rolling inside the cannon barrel, they used a kind of sabot, a wooden base, a sort of small wooden casing where the shell was placed, which kept it from rolling around. Then the ball was tied with light metal bands so it wouldn't slip down, and these bands would open or break when the shot was fired. Also, the charge, the primer, the fuse, so to speak, was placed in front of the shell, facing the muzzle of the cannon, precisely so it wouldn't ignite prematurely. And instead of using regular black powder, which could cause ignition problems, it used mercury fulminate. And so, the shell was already safer than the ones used before. But Paixhans also designed a cannon that could fire these shells. A fairly large cannon with a strong, reinforced breech. This was possible thanks to advances in metallurgy. Meanwhile, in 1800, the Industrial Revolution had begun, Let's say the Second Industrial Revolution, the one of coal, metallurgy, steel, and so on. And so, with these extremely efficient and reinforced cannons, it was possible to use gunpowder charges greater than those used before. Because obviously, if the cannon that fired a solid shot of a certain weight could pierce the hull of a sailing ship without causing other damage, the shell also somehow needed to penetrate a bit into the hull before exploding, so it could cause major damage. So it was necessary to increase the size of the shell so that it would have a weight similar to that of smaller caliber solid shot. And so, this Paixhan's cannon basically had to fire shells as large as those fired by mortars, but at a speed that only a cannon could achieve, which meant it needed much more gunpowder than usual under the same conditions. But Paixhan's managed to build this cannon and demonstrated it at the Brest arsenal, in front of various officers and even some French government ministers, and basically, with a single shot, he almost managed to sink an old-style sailing ship. The shell went inside, exploded, and the vessel immediately caught fire. Then Paixhan's fired more shots, which basically turned that ship into a sieve. So with Paixhan's system, the cannon and the shell, it was basically the death knell for the great wooden sailing ships. For the time being, you understand that in the military, innovations are always a bit slow to catch on because it's a very conservative environment. But this was already a start. In fact, in the following years, more and more, military navies would begin to equip themselves with these extremely powerful Paixhan's cannons that fired these deadly explosive shells. But it wasn't, so there was no longer a need to have maybe 100 cannons. It was enough to have, I don't know, 7 or 8, maybe 4 on one side, 4 on the other, 1 at the stern, 1 at the bow, and that was it. At this point, wooden sailing ships became extremely vulnerable because with these cannons, it was enough to hit them just once and, really, they would suffer massive damage. And especially if you hit a ship that was also carrying these Paixhan shells, well, if you hit the powder magazine, the whole thing could blow up in a single shot. So these ships, these wooden sailing vessels, went from being fortresses on the sea to basically floating coffins, because with this new cannon, it took very little to blow them up. And it was also risky just to carry these same munitions, because if you got hit, you'd blow up, you'd be blown to pieces. But the innovations weren't just in terms of weaponry. There was also the invention of the engine, the steam engine. So, the renowned inventor, Robert Fulton, in the early 1800s, ingeniously invented the revolutionary steamship, which, instead of relying solely on traditional sails, utilized a powerful engine with large, rotating wheels that functioned much like a water mill, effectively propelling these impressive vessels through the water. Initially, this type of engine was mainly used for civilian ships, for merchant ships, because you could understand that with a wheel, with 1 or 2 side wheels, it was very easy for the enemy to hit the engine. The engine was clearly on the surface, and hitting the wheels or the drive shaft made them very vulnerable. Moreover, these wheels made it impossible to place cannons on the sides. So, at first, military navies did not take advantage of this innovation. However, the idea of putting an engine on a ship was still important. In fact, A few years later, the inventor John Ericsson, a Swede, invented the propeller, the screw propulsion, which completely revolutionized the whole concept of boats. Also, the engines at the time were, how can I put it, primitive and had low power. These gigantic wheels didn't allow for much speed. With the propeller, everything changed because the propeller was first of all placed under the ship, underwater, so the engine could also be placed below the waterline, making it much less vulnerable. Because of how the propeller is designed, it required much less engine power to give the ship greater speed, so it had greater propulsion, and so yes, this was an innovation that was adopted by naval forces from around 1840 onward. And so we see that military ships with steam engines and propellers started to appear, but they also still had sails. The reason was that, even though the engine was important, they still depended too much on coal supplies and on the fresh water needed to run the steam mechanism. When there were long ocean crossings, these ships tended to use their sails to save fuel. Then, maybe during combat, they would use the engine. I also remember something very interesting. As I mentioned before, sailing ships were very vulnerable if they were near the coast and got caught in a storm. This problem no longer existed with the engine, so you would start the engine and, in a way, you could overcome the force of the sea pushing you toward the shore. You were also free from dependence on the wind, but you did become dependent on fuel. However, by combining wind and engine power, these ships had achieved a certain level of efficiency. But the innovations didn't stop there. In fact, as I mentioned earlier, with the increasing use of cannons and Pake's-Hen shells, naval engineers realized that there was a greater need to protect the hulls, so they started adding metal protections, armor plating, and we'll see how these will be used in the years to come. There's already plenty on our plate for now, so I'll stop here and we'll see each other in the next episodes.